brothers, do you recall when the grasslands reached to the horizon? And the deafening roar of countless wings overhead. Back when Rome was a village at Britain, the Emerald Island. Before we gave up on our future and buried our dead. All right, guys, I guess it's 7 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and go start. So this is our episode, what is it, 26, I think? And we are starting on the ancient Greeks, which is a huge topic. Now, I know I said last time I was going to do costume this episode, but I will not do costume because, well, it's been just a crazy couple of days. And yeah, I had my shot today. I didn't know how I was going to feel. But since we're going to be doing Greeks for a minute, I will have a chance to wear my lovely Medusa costume yet. I don't know how good I'm going to be today, but I will do my best. Again, I wanted to say thank you to Marvine. Thank you to his whole team for the material that I partially am using. Thank you to all the researchers throughout time and history who have studied the ancient Greeks. They're probably the most studied civilization as far as the Western culture goes. If you like what we're doing, if you like the podcast, please go ahead and like us or dislike us if you don't like it. Comment, that helps us out a lot. Also, if you want to participate, I'm going to go ahead and put a link to the group on Facebook that I have. So you can just contact me through that group and let me know if you want to be a part of this podcast next time. And for those who are interested, we do it every other Thursday at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. That's United States Mountain Time. So, episode 26, we're doing the Greeks as we know them, not the pre-Greeks, not the Achaean Greeks. We're doing the Dorian Greeks, which later will turn out into, of course, our classical Greece and into the, the Hellenic world as such. Now, Greeks in general are overstudied and I think partially overestimated, overemphasized in the Western culture because they have had such an enormous impact on the Roman civilization, which came just a little bit later, and which had borrowed a lot from the Greeks. Some things that borrowed indirectly, a lot of things that just directly dug up and moved to Roman cities. And of course, Rome is something that influenced our today's Western world absolutely enormously. Another reason I think that the Greeks made such a big deal in the Western world is because Greeks introduced the concept of democracy. Now, we will talk about democracy a little bit more, not in this episode, but we will talk about the difference between what Greeks had and called democracy and what we call democracy today, which are two big differences, as they say in the city of Odessa. Sorry, old Russian joke. Who are the Dorian Greeks? Where did they come from? How do they differ from the people who lived in the territories we now know as Greece? Who are these people in general? Well, they were part of the so-called Iron Horde, or the Great Migration of the peoples that swept through the Bronze Age world and facilitated greatly in the Bronze Age collapse, which we have talked about in the previous podcasts. The territory, let me pull up a map actually really quickly. These maps are not necessarily period accurate, but they give you some idea as to what territories we're talking about. So this is the kind of a map that shows the Dorian invasion. Now, today it is debated whether or not it was an invasion per se, or it was more of a migration. There's, in my personal opinion, for having looked at the material quite closely, having traveled to Greece and, having been fascinated with Greek history for quite some time, in my opinion, it was very much kind of an invasive migration, if you can say it that way, because there were cities that were just wiped out, and certainly the elites of the people who were previously populating the region, which would have been the descendants of the Minoans and also the Mycenaean Greeks, which have by this point in time established their own culture, their own way of life. They had very elite dominant societies, to where especially the Mycenaean societies, where you had the elites living in their palaces, which may to us not seem much of a palace today, but they were still far better than the life of the farmers around them. And so you had the military elites that rode back and forth in their chariots. And of course, you had the commoners who did not have much as far as rights, because by the time the Dorian invasion happened, the Mycenaean Greece has existed long enough to where the elites have consolidated and have become more or less closed in their ranks, and it was really hard for a commoner to make their way up. So the Dorian Greeks who came and rolled over this Mycenaean Minoan world, they were not very different as far as their language goes from the people that they were conquering or the people that they were migrating right over the heads of, basically. Their language was probably, I mean, very rough guesstimate. I mean, it would be the difference between, let's say, Russian and Polish, maybe even a little bit further than that, to where they could understand each other to a certain degree. They could understand that these were not some dog-headed weirdos from outskirts of the planet, that these were more or less related to them tribes. They had a lot of common aspects of their culture. I mean, they shared the same Indo-European values, such as chariots, and the idea of Indra, which was called Zeus in the Greek variation. They had common deities, and they had similar language, and they could, to a point, understand each other's culture and way of thinking. What they brought with them, besides their iron technology, they brought with them that drive of a migrating tribe, of migrating peoples. And they brought, and first of all, it wasn't a single tribe. We're talking about a group of related tribes, sometimes, loosely associated tribes of various typology, of various ethnic origin, who drove before them also hordes of people they have displaced from their own lands, and also slaves. And these were, like any barbarian invasion, these people were very warlike. They had nothing to lose, nowhere to go back to. And unlike the Achaean Greeks, who by this point in time have grown pretty comfortable and had something to lose back at home, their wealth, their families, their homes, the invaders did not really have that kind of luxury to fight for. So when the Dorians came to the Achaean world, different parts of what we would call the Achaean Greece reacted differently, and they all had different fates. Some cities, such as, well, first of all, a lot of cities had their kings and their nobility pick up their swords and their shields and march outside the city walls to fight off the invaders. And therefore, there they died, leaving pretty much the commoners behind. Not all of these commoners were that unhappy about the fact that they were being invaded and the fact that they were being taken over by the newcomers, because a lot of these commoners have had up to here of their kings and their elite. For example, in the city of Thebes, the commoners were quite pleased when they found out that the Dorians killed their king. They were quite pleased to open the city gates. In some cities, such as Athens, it was more of an issue of admixture, and we will go in a little bit more detail about that. In some places, such as Sparta, it was a catastrophic and totalitarian invasion and a domineering ruling regime. So, Doros, where the word Doros comes from, it's basically metal carriers, the ones who had metal. They overlapped the locals very unevenly. So in the east, cities like Athens, Megaris, Salamine, they were free-ish of the Dorian domineering. In the north, Thebes, Corinth, they were more or less half and half, to where the nobility admixed and kind of formed a joint elite. What happened in Sparta? Now, Peloponnesus really was the breadbasket of ancient Achaean Greece. It was the fat, very rich Sparta, where there was a lot of cattle. They were traders. They didn't like to get engaged in too many wars. It's the only flat plains, fertile plains in that region, really, and it's the best place for grazing, for growing anything. This was kind of the most coveted part of the territory, and these Spartans, the Spartans that we have heard about in the Trojan War epic story, they got completely overran. What happened is invading tribes came and they completely subjugated, enslaved, terrorized, and I don't even know how to begin to explain the inhumane conditions that they put the original population of that territory into. The tribes invading this region, in the Laconia region, they were the most warlike of all the Dorian tribes, and they have met a lot of resistance. When they subjugated the local population, they decided that they were not to mix with the locals in any way, shape, or form. You were better off taking as a wife or husband a foreigner than to take a local. That was considered to be unacceptable. They were considered to be less than humans. They were not allowed to have any weapons. They were not allotted any rights whatsoever. They were called helots, and every 2-3 years, the Spartans would hold this, because these people, of course, tried to overthrow the invading and this tyrannical, absolutely horrific rule. The people, locals, tried to rise up over and over and over every couple of years until the Spartans finally instituted a practice where they would go around and just randomly kill adult males from the local population, just to keep, first of all, the population of able-bodied, fighting capable adult males, and also just keep the population in general completely suppressed. So the condition that the Helots were living in were absolutely unimaginable. They were not even considered to be good enough to be slaves in the homes of the Spartans. If they were considered to be state property, they were not owned by any individual peoples. They were not allowed to be sold outside of Spartan territory. If they were allowed into the cities, they were kept in special kind of segregated quarters, and they were only allowed to do very heavy labor. If Spartans required actual domestic slaves, they would purchase them elsewhere. Spartans constantly were in a state of war with the local population, because there was quite fewer Spartans physically than there were of the locals. And even though they terrorized and disarmed the local population, the Spartans still were constantly afraid of the uprising, of being overthrown, of being overran. And so what they did is they perpetually migrated throughout Spartan territory, kind of a war camps, the males did, and constantly waged war basically on their own subjugated peoples, which made the other Greek city-states look at them like they were a little bit on the crazy side, but they were so good at war, they were so militarized, so unified, that really, in case of an outside threat to the whole territory, they were invaluable allies. Judging by the Spartan society, you can kind of imagine what the original Dorian society might have been like. For example, one of the good things about Sparta is one of the very few Greek city-states where women had something close to equal rights. Women as well as men were involved in physical exercise. They were both raised in very tough conditions. They had to mature early. They were taken away from their families. No proper family units were formed. I mean, a husband spent most of his time away from the home. He spent most of men did not live in houses with their families. Moreover, children didn't live in houses with their families. Once they hit the age of 7, they were pretty much sent off to boarding schools where very vigorous, very cruel at times training began. But the women were also very athletic, very war capable. They were not per se warrior women, but they were meant to exercise, to keep themselves in good shape, so they could be tough, they could support their men, so that they would be healthy for childbirth. In that sense, the queens in Sparta and women in general in Sparta probably had more say and more power than anywhere else in ancient Greece. There's actually an exchange recorded between one of the Spartan queens and one of Greek visitors from another part of Greece, where the accusation was that only in Sparta can women have so much power over men, to which the Spartan queen responded was only in Sparta do women give birth to real men. And that was one of the other traits that the Spartans had. They really liked really short, to the point, and very kind of meaningful expressions. They tried to keep their speech minimal. They tried to live a minimalist lifestyle, not to have a lot of opulence, not to have a lot of possession. They tried to live like they were always in a state of kind of migration, war, and defense, I guess. Very militarized state. I'm going to stop for a second, see if anybody has anything to say about these guys.
Well, it's we often think of invading, quote, barbarian tribes as being like disorganized and being very just wild, if you will. But the invading Dorians are incredibly organized. They're incredibly structured, and kind of gives you an idea. Okay, where did they come from? I mean, where they didn't develop this out of any out of air.
There's a concept, and again, it's not very popular today, and I'm using it very loosely. I'm not using it in its proper technical terms, but there's a concept of such thing as military communism, where you have, and you have this pop up in history throughout time over and over and over, where you're in a certain stage where there's, when peoples are at a point where they're expanding or they're migrating, and the military elites are just starting to form, and the kings are not that far removed from the other warrior elites, and they're almost like it's a brotherhood where it's the king is the better among the equals, kind of, where they're all treated as one big family. And oftentimes those you see that in, for example, in Germanic migrations, you see that in some of the early Russian formation of the Russian land. You see that, I mean, you see that everywhere, all over the world, where you have these warrior bands that have a group. In Hittites, we talked about it before, where the king is really, the greatest among the equals. And it's a brotherhood, and they share everything equally. And because there's such a limited, because these were smaller tribes, it wasn't like it was one big army marching on. It was groups, here, there, several tribes, several ethnicities, each one of them driven by by people who had to fight and claw their way to the top, whose talents as far as warfare, whose charisma, whose ability to attract followers really kind of brought them to the very top of the society, because the elites have not yet been consolidated. They have not been formed as such. So the people with most merit, and in this case, merit in warfare, organization, and ability to attract and maintain followers, rose up to the top. And these people really gave an impulse of activity, an impulse of I don't even know how to put it. It's there's a Russian, he is actually a poet and an explorer, and not so much a historian. His name is Gumilev. He came up with a theory, and it's called the theory of passionarism. And his theory suggests that every population has a sort of a degree of kinetic energy in it. That's called, he calls passionarism, which is the kind of energy, and it's measured in the amount of individuals within the population who are willing to take high risks, venture outside of their comfort zone, who are willing to be active, to take risky behaviors, and the more people there are within a group with those tendencies, the more mobile, the more kinetic energy that group has. And so usually what happens when you have, and this is not a scientific theory, this is a theory of ethnogenesis that was proposed by Gumilev, which most historians absolutely disagree with, and yet it has a certain capacity of explaining, or at least portraying the way these things work. But when this kind of energy builds up within a group, the group starts moving forward. It starts either inventing things or migrating somewhere or having great conquests or something like that, because that energy is driving it. But once that energy starts running out, once those people who are leading that charge start to die off as a result of either warfare, migration, or whatever else, then the society slows down. And it seems like the younger societies, the ones that are just forming and coming, or just coming together, they seem to have a higher potential for that kind of passionarism. And that's really the only way I can really explain the overall success of almost every barbaric horde. They have so much drive behind them. Oftentimes they have something to fight for, to where settled civilizations really have enough a lot to be afraid about and enough a lot to lose behind their back. So when you have a car, house, wife, 2.5 kids, dog, you're less likely to take very big risks to when you have nothing to lose. You have your starving family in a wagon right behind you, and nowhere to go. And things can only get better from this point in time. So why not take a risk? You have nowhere to back up to. I guess that's the best explanation I can really offer in that sense. Did that help at all? Kind of a lengthy venturing into a different direction, but yeah.
Well, yeah, and just as a parallel, you see today with our technology, our culture, if you will, and how few people have led that charge.
Right. Yeah, and at that point, I'm usually at the heights of a civilization wealth. That passionarism, according to Gumilev, level gets pretty low, and once it starts dropping once the inertia runs out, the society starts slowing down. It becomes settled, it becomes rich, and then it starts declining shortly thereafter. That was a theory that he was talking about, but yeah. So in the East, we have Athens. What is Athens at this point in time? Well, Athens is the last stronghold of the local Achaean Greeks. Athens has survived because it is far away, it is well defended, and because all the refugees from the surrounding regions, especially the elites, fled and flooded towards Athens. During this time, Of course, their two biggest deities, as we've talked about in the Minoan episode, were really Poseidon and Athena. Poseidon being the older kind of chthonic deity, and Athena being a much more humanoid, much more logical deity. Well, the cult of Poseidon, starting with the Dorian invasion in Athens, starts to kind of fall to the background, while the cult of Athena becomes very much central. And this is not the Athena we think about when we look at various Greek statues and when we think about the Greek pantheon. This is the Athena with a helmet on her head, was really kind of was, what's the word for it? I just lost. From swords, you get calluses on her hands because she's a goddess of war. She's a goddess of cold logic. She is the goddess of skilled labor, not crafts, even necessarily not art, but skilled labor, engineering, inventing, stuff like that. Weaving. Well, she invented not so much weaving as she invented the loom. So I think she's more. She's the lady who's going to get her arms up to the elbows in machine oil, basically tinkering with various inventions. She's the one who will get the tractor running. She's the one who is going to pick up, your sawed-off shotgun and go defending the local village. Athena was an absolutely legendary figure during this period. There was a lot of rumors about the fact that different invading leaders had nightmares, for example, where she appeared and threatened them. A lot of the success of the Athenian defense was oftentimes assigned to the personal participation of Athena. Starting in this period, she was the deity who had personally stood with a sword in her hand and defended the city, and she became very highly revered. Now, Athens and Sparta continued to be each other's pretty much diametric opposites throughout their history. They were never-ending rivals. They had completely opposing cultures. They had opposing worldviews. They had even opposing ethnicities in a sense living in them. They were never quite fond of each other. And this is a rivalry, I can't even pronounce it, that's going to continue throughout the existence of the both city-states. So Athens was known for its architecture. Even in those days, Athens was considered to be the city that was known for its beautiful architecture. These are some reconstructions. Whatever inventions and whatever progress was made in the world architecture, Athens was always a little bit ahead of it. Athens was to be considered to be the city to be visited, to be revered. It was marveled at even before its great rise after the war with Persia. Athenians, because they were never quite broken, they were never quite downtrodden, they retained in them a certain kind of self-confidence and a curiosity to where they traveled all around as far as they could. They felt comfortable and competent traveling. They had no problem learning from other peoples and cultures around them and bringing this knowledge back home. One of the shining examples, of course, we all know the word mausoleum, and I'm sure everybody has heard the history of how that building was built. But when a certain half-Egyptian ruler passed away in one of the colonies of Greece, the Athenian architects were commissioned to build him a monument that was supposed to combine both Greek and Egyptian elements. And so what we have is, and I'll find it for the next episode, they had basically a pyramid that kind of had a very Greek colonnade on top of it. I mean, Athenians had no problem experimenting. They had no problem combining things. They were very confident peoples in that sense. They were very proud to be who they were. Now, back to Sparta, architecture of Sparta. What architecture of Sparta? And they had the big war temple in the center, probably covered in copper plates that made a lot of warlike, thumping noise. People lived more or less in not very fancy dwellings. As I already said, men lived away. Children above the age of 7 lived away. Men were only allowed to visit their wives under certain conditions. There's even some rumors, which are not historically necessarily provable, that as a part of the marriage ceremony, a man was supposed to sneak in without being noticed by his wife's defenders, his wife's family, and manage to overpower the woman and take her by force to where she fought him off full force, because he had to prove to her that he was a worthy man, and she had to prove to him that she was a worthy woman. So, and it had to be done in the dead of night. Usually the newlyweds did not know each other until this wonderful and romantic encounter took place. So you can imagine how close these men were to their wives and their children. Whom they were close to were their military comrades, with whom they spent the majority of their adult life, and actually even their childhood. Starting at the age of 7, the boys lived with other military men, usually older boys, who worked particularly hard on them, physical punishments, hunger. They were trained for a life of hardship, basically. So children were put through absolutely vigorous survival training that not everybody made it through, at least according to some of the sources. And even as grown men, they were still constantly in that boot camp state. Like they never got out of boot camp, which is not a life I would necessarily wish on anyone, but they did build an amazing fighting spirit among them. And of course, if the man had to go off and die in a war, the famous phrase that is ascribed to one of the Spartan women, that go fight and return either with the shield or on the shield. Well, that would be a lot easier to say if you only saw your husband in the dead of night a couple times a year. I would assume it would be a lot less heartbreaking if you went off and died in battle. But that's just mostly being kind of funny. Let's see. What else do I have here to say about Sparta? I think that's, we're going to go in a little, David wants to jump in for a second about Sparta. We will go in a little bit more depth about all these things. I just want to do a general overview. Can I do the colonization real quick? And then, so another phenomenon that happened at the time of the Dorian invasion it gave the kind of push start to the phenomenon of the Greek colonization. Originally, the first wave was the Achaean Greeks just running the heck away from this entire Bronze Age collapse, from this entire invasion, from the discord and everything else that was happening on the mainland Greece. Now, the elites, as I've already mentioned, they have died. More or less, they fought valiantly outside of their city walls and died. So the refugees who ran away and formed the original colonies were mostly the commoners, the people who didn't want to fight valiantly, who wanted to protect their goods and wanted to protect their merchant and family interests, and they fled. And when they fled and they formed these new colony cities, they oftentimes sat there and they thought, well, we had kings, the kings oppressed us, they didn't defend us whatsoever, no more kings. And oftentimes these colony cities, cities that were the Greek colonies, they did not want to have they wanted to do everything differently than the way they did it back home before this horrible thing happened. So oftentimes they were ruled by either the people who owned the ships, basically the most influential, the richest people in the group of refugees which would be the people who had ships, and they oftentimes became a part of this ruling class, the new elite, or they would elect among themselves the most influential, wisest people, and they literally would have shares in the ruling of the city. And when we don't have kings, when we have basically random people who all more or less equals with each other, well, in that case, we need to make decisions on daily life. And instead of voting on things like they traditionally voted on, for example, who's going to be the next person to sit in council, these people started voting on things like, day-to-day running of their cities. And that's how the voting concept first got introduced and kind of appeared in that region. They were kind of republic city-states, like Novgorod would be later, like a lot of these trade cities of Middle Ages would be. And these colonies started rapidly getting wealthy and rapidly prospering and multiplying. And well, why did this happen? First of all, unlike mainland Greece, they were infertile lands. The lands that a lot of them took up were the former Hatti lands, which got kind of depopulated and rolled over by the Bronze Age collapse. So they had much more fertile territories to work with. In addition, that horrible Bronze Age collapse, that time of discord and warfare, it started coming to an end. And so the world in general started reviving. And when the world is starting to revival, people want to buy goods, people want to trade goods, but people are still scared to go out of their hiding spots and face this nuclear wasteland that's all around them. And they needed entrepreneuring, very brave, very cunning, and willing to risk themselves fellows, such as the Greeks of at that time, who would be willing to be the go-betweens between various locales to exchange goods, to exchange ideas, news. And so the colonies started prospering. And once these colonies started prospering, well, the mainland Greek people who lived on the mainland were sitting around and looking at each other going, well, wait a minute, my cousin, he moved to a colony and he now is rich and he is now well off and he has a nice plot of land to farm and he, has a nice trading arrangement with the neighboring city. Well, I won't like that. Why am I sitting here on this rocky plot of land where there is only one goat and we already ate the goat? And why do I have to deal with these kings? So the local, basically people who were commoners, more poor people, they started to rebel. They started to rise up. But before we get to that, I want to back up a little bit about what was going on with the political and social organization in these city-states. At this time, the kings more or less got wiped out. The Dorians didn't really have kings as a concept. There were some kings early on, but what happened oftentimes, especially in Athens, where you had a bunch of nobility flock there from all over Greece, you had a situation where the head king died in battle, who he left behind a bunch of relatives, plus a bunch of other nobles from neighboring city-states who were all more or less each other's equals. And of course, they all wanted to rule Athens because, well, I'm a king and you're a king and you're a king's grandson and you're a king's son and you're a king's nephew, and we're all equals, we all want to rule. So it was kind of a medieval Poland. There was a bunch of nobles and not a lot of commoners. So they had to figure out a way to divide power among themselves. So they came up with this institute of archons, which was which was basically a theocracy. It was a ruling council of nobles who took rotation in ruling of the city. And in Athens, for a while, even their calendar was modeled after the time periods of which certain ruler. So I'm a king for a year, you're a king for a year, she's a king for a year. Well, she cannot be a king, but let's pretend that that's the case. But basically, they would rotate this, and each individual ruler could be only ruler for up to 5 times. They could only do it for a year, and then they had to rotate out, and it was decided more or less by voting. That had a lot of intriguing and a lot of hostility behind it. And this council of nobles, of course, as councils of nobles tend to do, they mostly looked out for the interests of the nobles and not so much of the common people. So common people would get sick of this going on once in a while. And so they would find one of the nobles who didn't think he was being treated fairly and who had something to offer to the common people. And the common people would say, okay, you're going to be our king for a minute. Except by this point in time, Greeks in general were very suspicious of the word king in everywhere but Sparta. We'll come back to Sparta in a minute. So they were very suspicious of the word king, so they did not name their their ruler, their leader of their revolution ruler. They didn't call him king, they called him a tyrant. Tyrant didn't really have a negative connotation to it in the ancient Greece. It didn't mean oppressive, it didn't mean domineering, it just meant that you came to power by the will and by the uprising of the people. You took the power by the uprising of the people. Tyrants could have been good, they could have been bad. Some tyrants were absolutely outstanding. But as a general rule, all the tyrants wanted to establish their own dynasty. And as a general rule, they failed to do so because the Greek people, while the tyrant himself probably came up in a situation of hardship and situation of knowing that he has to please the general public, that he has to be on the same wavelengths with the common folks, his son probably was brought up by his father and kind of to a point inherited those traditions, but usually by the time the grandchildren came around, they already were brought up in a lavish, kind of spoiled, kingly environment. And oftentimes the people just overthrew them and went back to the original form of rule. So in a lot of the cities of the Greek city-states, we had this back and forth between you have a rule of a local nobility council, people get sick of it, you have a tyrant. They get sick of the tyrant, they overthrow the tyrant, they have another nobility council, and on and on and on it went. Gonna stop for a second.
So I'm very curious about the calendar. And did the various city-states have their own separate calendars?
Yep.
And so that's kind of like one question. And then it also sounds somewhat similar to the Imperial Japanese calendar, if you will. And perhaps Ryan could share something about that.
About which part? The Japanese?
Chinese calendar.
I actually don't know anything about that. Sorry, Nathan. I wish that I did.
I know that Romans oftentimes dated their years by the name of the emperor who was ruling. Or by the, yeah, well, it depends by who. But basically it was kind of, it would have been like, for example, it's like the first year of Trump's presidency, of Trump's first presidency, you know, the second year of Obama's second presidency, the first year of Nixon's first presidency, and so on and so forth, which drives the modern historians absolutely crazy because some of these people had similar names, even the same names. Some of these people were in the office multiple times and up to 5 times. And to try to align, so you will get a list of events that is very clearly dated, very perfectly good, except to anybody who is not Athenian living in that time. That makes absolutely zero sense.
What I know about the Japanese calendars is that it was a little bit confusing, but I just don't know any specifics about it. I think it was maybe even trouble in China. I'm not really sure though.
Oh, I'm sure. There's always trouble between, you know, I'm not going to make it.
I think it was the year of the person or the house that was ruling in Japan. I believe when I was in Japan from 1967 to 1969, it was year number 57 and year number 58.
Right. Right.
That was on my insurance document for my motorcycle. That's how I knew that. If does anybody else have anything else to say, or I'm going to jump onto Sparta real quick.
I just had a quick question about the word tyrant. Now, I never knew where that had come from before. Is there like some specific timeline around, you know, the timeline, you know, the times that we're talking about where tyrant had a negative, you know?
Not in originally in Greek history. It did not during the time period we're talking about. It was about 600 to 700 BC, if I'm correct. But it basically it meant like, I don't know how to put it. Revolutionary. That's not even, because it would be a nobleman, a nobleman who would be kind of like Fidel Castro, if that makes sense. That's probably the close association. That was not an exact parallel to where you have a charismatic, more or less elite figure who, you know, positions themselves to be in opposition to the ruling elite. Basically, the elite underdog who says, look, people, you're not happy with how you're being governed, and I can offer you something better. The thing with tyrants, they always had to have an election, so to speak, an election promise to the people. For example, one of the tyrants had promised that, and he did, you know, fulfill his promise that he was going to equate all the people of the city before the law. Up until that point in time, the law was different for commoners and for the ruling elites, and the people did not like that. So a tyrant came with an election promise saying that, look, I'm going to make sure that if somebody commits a crime, everybody's punished equally, regardless of whether you're a commoner or a member of the elite. Another tyrant form and his son, Dion and Dionysius, father and the son were bloody, cruel bastards, excuse my language, but they did abolish slavery for a while in their city-state as a part of their election campaign. And then the tyrant Theoclesius built the temple of Artemis in the city, which I cannot pronounce, Ephesus. I did pronounce it finally. So each tyrant would come with some sort of a campaign, was a campaign promise, was you know, a program that they would have to fulfill. Otherwise, the people would very quickly throw them back where they came from. And it's interesting. One of the most famous tyrants of Athens was the tyrant. It's so confusing to me why you guys end the us on the end of every Greek word. Physistratus in Russian, so I guess it would be Physistratus in English. He was a very popular tyrant. His rule was very beloved. He was very beloved. He was very successful, a charismatic and smart tyrant could be very beloved by the people, quite successful in his rule, and very fondly remembered. This is the case with Pisistratus. But he, of course, like most of them, wanted to establish a dynasty, and he actually asked the oracle in Delphi whether or not his family was going to be able to rule in Athens. And the answer that he got from the oracle was that you will be blessed, Pisistratus, I can't even pronounce it, and your sons will be blessed, but your grandsons will not. And that prophecy generally held true, because usually it was the third generation that grew spoiled and entitled, and the people got sick of them and very quickly got rid of them, which is exactly what happened to the sons of this tyrant. So the main thing about tyrants, they could not come to power without the support of the people. And the whole time they were in the office, they knew that the only reason they were in the office while they were on the throne is because they had that commoner support. They constantly had to keep in mind what the peoples wanted. Because the moment that the people stopped defending this individual, the old elites would step in and take their traditional places back. So, and another thing is, I mean, generally when you're talking about a king, you talk about kind of a God-appointed divine blood, you elect sacred blood of the king. I mean, that's a concept that even comes up in medieval Europe over and over. Well, with tyrants, that was not the case. They knew the entire time that was the people who put them there, and that was the people who could take them down. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that explains a lot of it to me. I guess the term just kind of evolved in politics. One of the reasons that I wondered about it is there was a supposed exchange between the philosopher Plato and I forget who it was, and Plato accused him of being a tyrant, and it seemed like a negative thing, but I didn't really even know where the term came from.
Yeah, well, tyrant, I know what you're quoting. In that case, the tyrant was not used in our modern sense. It did not mean that you were a horrible, oppressive dictator. What he meant is that you unlawfully have seized power. Does that make sense? It's basically, tyrant meant somebody who seized power rather than was born to power or had a right to power. So that just meant that you came to power by force.
No, that does make sense. That does explain some of it. So thank you.
Right. So, of course, the colonies were prospering, and after the first wave of migration, which was the Achaean wave of migration, you know, the Dorian Greeks started also looking to build their own colonies and to gain their own success and wealth. And the second wave, they were more or less volunteers, following in the footsteps of the first wave. Some of the cities that were founded that way were Syracuse, Chersonesus, the Italian Messina, which Messina is an interesting story behind it. So refugees, they were basically refugees from the Greek version of Messina, Messia, because originally when Spartans took, you know, what became Sparta, and the same tribe more or less took also the nearby Messia, they took it and then they kind of rolled through and moved on to war, and they went off to war and they mostly died. And so even though they have subjugated the locals and made them into helots, they now did not have enough men to reproduce. And so they made a unique decision. They allowed their peoples to intermarry with the locals. And they went as far as raising a whole generation of these mixed marriage offspring who were brought up as citizens, as basically Spartans, I mean, for lack of a better term, when neighboring Sparta came over and annexed them. And when Sparta took over the territory, they said, well, look, you're all basically a result of disgusting and you know, blood mixing unions. You're slaves. You're not Greeks anymore. You're not anything special. And these people were raised as normal, free people. So a lot of them fled, and they fled to Italy. And there they founded the city of Messina, which was very successful. As a general rule, you know, huh? Well, it's, yeah, but I mean, basically you're more or less.
It's Italy now.
It's, yeah, it's Italy. Don't confuse me, Gaul. It's not France. Sorry. The Italian colonies were very notoriously and famously rich. One of the cities, for example, was called Sybaris. And of course, Sebarite, I assume, is a term that people have heard about. So in a lot of these territories, especially in Italy, the Greeks didn't meet a lot of resistance because they were In some cases, they were far more technologically and just organizationally advanced than the locals. Of course, when the Etruscans started developing, they were interacting with the Greeks very heavily. They started oftentimes trading, learning from and exchanging ideas with the Greeks. The Phoenicians and the Greeks had a lot interactions, both love and war. They had a lot of things in common, but the Phoenicians tended to brave the open waters more so than the Greeks. The Greeks sailing generally went around hugging the shores. They did not like to go out into the open seas as much as the Phoenicians did. Carthage was watching all of this with much curiosity. Now, the Carthage is going to become major competition to the Greek colonies later on. But at this point in time, it was kind of looking at these newcomers in an amused, kind of patronizing way. And a lot of these Greek city-states, the colonies, they also were formed on territory what later became the Persian Empire. And a lot of them organically became a part of the Persian Empire. So when you're talking about the Greek-Persian wars, really it's more Greek-Greek wars, because fighting on the side of the Persian Empire, especially when it came to fleet, were oftentimes also Greeks. They were just Greeks from the other side of the water, basically. So the third wave was the mainland Greece, which started basically having overpopulation situation, and they started actively sending out their youth to settle, and this is much later on, actively sending out their youth to explore unsettled lands and to form new colonies. And the funny part about this third migration wave is that these colonies were not, city-states were not considered to be, in other words, if you were a youth who grew up in Athens and you were sent off, or you decided to go off to colonize some unknown land with a group of your compatriots, and you guys founded a new city, you were still technically Athenian citizens until such a time that you decided to separate yourself from your mother city, from metropolis. That's where the term metropolis comes from. It's the mother city. So in a way, they were kind of reproducing by cloning themselves all over the place. And it was a competition, which city-state would have more clones located around the world. So these colonies were very profitable. They were the breadbasket of mainland Greece, because truly the mainland Greece was not very fertile at all. And whatever fertile potential it had, by the time of classical Greece as we know it, has been more or less exhausted. Greeks were relentless in cutting down trees in forests. I mean, they deforested it was a pretty rocky kind of hilly terrain to begin with. They deforested it. They hunted everything that could be eaten to death. Everything that couldn't be eaten, they hunted to death too. There were a few sacred groves left here and there towards the end of classical Greece. Every time there was a war, one or another sacred grove would get accidentally cut down for firewood. So today, Greece is a pretty bare territory. I mean, not very fertile land. And of course, that assists with erosion. So yes, the colonies were absolutely essential source of wealth for the metropolic cities. Spartans, on the other hand, they were not very, they did not like to get out on the sea at all. They didn't have much of a navy. They didn't like to travel much. Moreover, they didn't really like the idea of trading so much, to such a degree. So in Soviet Union, just a little step back, in Soviet Union, we had the ruble, right? Well, the ruble wasn't money in the same sense that the dollar is money, because you could not take a ruble and exchange it for any other currency in the world. What the ruble was basically a promissory note to you as a citizen from the state, saying that with this coupon, you can purchase this equivalent in goods. That concept is kind of similar to what the Spartans had. They discouraged wealth to such a degree that their money were basically metal rods, like really long ones, that were very uncomfortable to carry around. And of course, you cannot trade those with anybody outside of Sparta, because who in their right mind would exchange any goods for that? Big, long stick that was heavy and unpleasant to carry around and completely worthless as far as actual monetary value goes. So any purchases that the state needed, the state made. Really, Sparta acted in a very almost communist sense in that way, to where it was very state-centered. And they kept their kings. Unlike the surrounding city-states, Sparta kept their kings almost until the end, but they had two kings. They had a two-king system and two queens. So their kings, they had to come from one of the two families. Legend says that there were originally two brothers that originated this two-king system. One king would always have to stay and handle the day-to-day running of Sparta, while the other king went off to war. And then they would switch. The two queens were also very powerful figures. It was ideal if those two queens came from the same family and they were actually blood sisters. No, there was quite a bit of rivalry and quite a bit of, how would you put it, aggressive, not very ladylike behavior according to ancient Greeks among the ancient Spartan women. They were athletic, they were just very likely to make serious decisions. They were not far behind their men in a lot of things. And another thing about the women in Sparta is that if a woman, there was only two ways that a person could be recognized in the society of Sparta to actually, you know, have a memorialized, and that is if you were a warrior who died defending Sparta, or if you were a woman who died in childbirth, giving a son to Sparta. Those two deaths were considered to be equally heroic. Now, in addition to the two kings, there was also a consul. So this consul had a certain role. It was a council of priests. It did not have the right to suggest any solutions or to interfere in the state affairs in any other way than to veto any decision made by either one of the kings. By saying, look, this is not according to the tradition, we do not approve of it. Nope, come up with a different solution. Other function that this council body of wise men had is that if they deemed that the king committed treason against Sparta or behaved in an un-Spartan fashion, it was their duty to kill the king, which happened quite commonly throughout history of Sparta. So being a king in Sparta was definitely a very daunting and very, not very rewarding task, I would assume. You had a lot of responsibility, not enough, a lot of rights, and not enough, a lot of benefits from that position. And in Sparta, the kings never really, there was not that separation. You know, the king kind of stayed really close to the people because just of the nature of society, you know, everybody was supposed to be equal. Everybody was supposed to be on the level with each other. Nobody was supposed to stand out. So that division between the poor and the rich really did not take place. And if it did, it wasn't so obvious. Of course, not counting the poor helots, which were treated as cattle at this point in time. I'm going to stop for a minute and see if anybody has anything to say.
I'm guessing that the history of Greece that I learned in school was a little bit overly romanticized. Sorry, I can't pronounce it correctly.
What did you learn in school? I'm just curious because I obviously didn't go to school for that part of it here.
Oh, it's just kind of, you know, the whole story about the Pantheon a little bit, and, you know, just how the Greeks were very hedonistic, and oh, it was just great to live in Greece and ancient Greece. That's basically what we were taught almost.
It was great to live in ancient Greece if you were citizen, wealthy, male, God's abiding, and if not too successful.
Right.
Because if you, we will talk a little bit more detail on how that lovely, you know, institution of ostracism, for example, worked. If you were too popular, too successful, yeah, it sucks to be you. There's nothing that we feared more than exile from their homeland, because the issue of being a citizen of a state was absolutely crucial to every single Greek person, because I'll go a little bit more detail. I keep saying a little bit more detail about it next time, because democracy is a whole separate subject. I have a friend who is a historian who specializes in ancient Greek democracy, and every time he hears the word democracy used in modern context, he grabs his hair and starts ripping it out. He says, this is not democracy. This has nothing to do with democracy. Because democracies that formed in Greece, it had to do with the fact that you had very limited physical land. And so you were somebody within a city-state as long as you were a citizen of the city-state. If you were a visitor or a person, even a free man living there as a non-citizen, you had no rights. You really didn't. You couldn't vote, you couldn't participate in decisions, you couldn't prosper. In order to be a citizen, you had to own even a small itty-bitty tiny, but a plot of land. Mm-hmm. And because the territory was so limited, every wars in Greece were fought over plots of land that were, I don't know, the size of, I don't know, today's playground. Because that plot of land could have been somebody's field. And that field was essential, not only because each and every Greek citizen was independent of any government and any social pressure, because he had his own source of food. Even if he had one wife, one slave, an itty-bitty plot of land, that plot of land he worked on. on land, your land, you were attached, physically attached to that land. The endless, patriotic speeches and poems and expressions by ancient Greeks, they're not about Greece. It's about my, I don't know, Sparta, or my, I don't know, some itty bitty little city out in the middle of nowhere. Their patriotism was tied to such small territories, and they would fight to, and that's another thing. If you lose that plot of land, for example, if there's a war with the neighbors and the border gets moved a little bit, and let's say 5 families lose their plots of land, they suddenly become nobodies. They become non-citizens. So each and every citizen of any territory would fight with, every grown adult male would fight with everything he had for any time that territory was threatened. And so the democracy in Greece was based on the fact that you were a free person, you were male, in other words, capable of holding up arms and defending your plot of land, that you were independent from any pressure because you had your own food source, and responsible enough to manage this possession of yours, and married. Once you were had established yourself as a respectable citizen, then you had a right to make the decision for the rest of the society. In other words, the democracy in Greece was basically a sum of votes of people who were responsible members of society, directly tied to the territory, completely free of influence or bribery, and with vested interest in the survival of that land, which is very different from the democracy we're looking at today. And that kind of political structure could have only formed in that place, in that time, due to the limited physical, limited geographical, and limited, and overflowing human resources. And that's why you have this unique Greek fighting formation form, because you don't have elites. You don't have elites. So when chariots get lost, what chariots in Greece? Where? Those mountain rocky slopes. The elites get more or less eradicated. I mean, chariots are only used anymore by really important people, basically as taxis, which is very accurately shown actually in the movie Troy. Most people don't have money for chariots. Horses, what horses in Greece? Where? So you have men who have the only weapon that they can afford, which is their shield and their sword, and they're standing like brothers, shoulder to shoulder, each one of them standing to the death for that little plot of land, that those plots of land together comprise their homeland, their essence, the beating heart of their very existence. That's why exile was such a horrible, horrible punishment. That's why ostracism was such a horrible punishment in Greece, because the moment you were forced to live anywhere outside of your citizenship, city-states, you became a nobody. You became basically a non-citizen, non-person. You were not quite a slave, but you were certainly not an individual. I hope that kind of made sense, that explanation.
Yeah, and Themistocles became too successful.
Yep.
Right. The moment you became too popular and too many people liked you, you would get kicked out, because they didn't like the idea of somebody rising to power. They were very terrified of the idea of having a king again. It's a fear that Romans shared, that for their own somewhat different reasons. Later, those two cultures got integrated. But you can see how much the original Achaean Greeks disliked kings, and how much the Dorian kings were not used to that. Because think about it, like in the barbaric tribal structure, again, we've talked about this with Hittites. For example, what do you have? You have a band of warriors, basically brotherhood of warriors, with one leader who says, hey, brothers, should we go and conquer Corinth today? Yeah, let's go conquer Corinth. Okay, well, after that, do you want to go conquer Syracuse? No, Syracuse. Okay. It's all decided by that kind of military communism, by that kind of military council of brothers, where you all sit down, talk to each other, and decide what you all want to do. That form of rule partially got transferred onto this form of state government, if that makes sense. So yeah, they did not like the idea of kings. They did not believe in the idea that anybody could be born to be a king. Greeks were very pragmatic. Even their religion is very pragmatic. Their relationship with gods is very give and take. I mean, they feared their gods, but they also saw them very practically. They were very, very superstitious peoples. Greeks were extremely superstitious. They would fulfill all the rituals. But there's some debate to what degree Greek religion was actually a religion, and to what degree it was actually more of set of ritualistic practices that broke up into individual, like people who visit someplace and then throw a coin into a fountain so that they would return, or people who walk by a certain statue and rub the dog's nose every time for luck, things like that. A lot of, not counting the the mysteries, the great religions of basically of mysteries, the ones that get introduced much later in Greek culture. A lot of the Greek worship was really just making sure you don't step on that crack on the road and not upset any deity, because their deities were more or less unpredictable and not necessarily moral in any way, shape, or form. So the Greeks also didn't believe in afterlife. Their idea of afterlife was so desperate and miserable and kind of dismal. Any Greek would much happier live right here and now than we see this quote in the Odyssey, where Odysseus talks to Achilles, and Achilles says, "I would rather be a slave up, basically on earth, than be the biggest king down here in the kingdom of shades." Because in Greek belief, once you died, you became a thoughtless, mindless, voiceless, memoryless shadow. And so with that being as your prospect of afterlife, you really try to live here and now mostly. So yeah, the Greeks knew how to live, they loved life, and they were not looking forward to its end at all. And I think that's about all I have to say. Did anybody else want to say anything else? All right. Nathan, you were going to say something?
Just a couple of things. One, it's interesting. So you're talking about their requirements of citizenship. And you look back at the history of the framing of our Constitution, and so much of the conversation of the framing of our Constitution was based upon land ownership. And that is deeply embedded into the framing of our Constitution, and came from that source, Greek culture.
About that also, Nathan, because that was originally part of our electoral college.
Well, and because the founding fathers, they were, at that time, the revival of the classical culture was at its height. And the United States originally was, if you look at the architecture, if you look at the names for things like Senate, it was very much modeled on, and even slavery, quite frankly, it was very much modeled on ancient Rome at the time when it was considered. And the idea that the only person who can be considered to be a citizen is anybody who is financially sound, and financially sound in ancient times meant a landowner. In other words, if you did not have a plot of land, you could not be financially sound, because how would you be independent? How would you have independent wealth? So even very rich people, that concept that being a part of the elite precludes having at least a little plot of land. That in order, you could be a free man, but you're free nothing unless you own a little plot of land that you can grow your own food on. That really is something that permeates the classical world. And that's where it came from into the Middle Ages, and then eventually into modern American constitution and just mentality up until recent times.
You have to have some skin in the game, as they say.
Right. Okay, I'm going to let David jump in.
Just a couple of things. One, about that democracy thing. In American history, as that the difference was there was a lot of land immediately adjacent that the western parts of the colonies meant that some not so well-to-do people became landowners. And so that's partially where that whole idea of a common man's democracy. The other thing I just wanted to touch on was the Helots in Sparta. Yeah, the Helots were regulated and terrorized to the degree that the Spartans worked it in their military training, that Spartans learned to kill as cadets, basically. As pups, yeah. As kids, learned to kill Helots to keep them in check, basically. And it was part of their mission to never get caught, and to no one should ever know a thing about it.
Yeah, and another thing, a couple more things I was going to say, as far as the democracy things, it wasn't only the right of any citizen of any Greek democracy to vote. It was his absolute obligation. I mean, you would get penalized if you didn't vote. The word idiot comes from a Greek word for somebody who does not participate in political life. The other thing I was going to say about the Helots, I mean, the thing is, these poor people, they were really used as training mannequins by the Spartans. David is absolutely right. The way that sometimes children were hardened up by being forced to butcher chickens and pigs and so on and so forth in, I don't know, in villages even today. These boys, I mean, sometimes boys as young as 8 years old would be trained how to take a human life by basically attacking defenseless family and just slaughtering the men, anybody, you know, who was considered to be a man or capable of holding a weapon. And they were literally, they were treated like mannequins. They were treated as not only subhuman, they were sub-animal. An animal was more likely to be treated with respect by the Spartans than one of their state-owned slave population. And that's why they would never sell them abroad. They were worried that there would be a large amounts of them accumulating somewhere in a different territory, and that they could organize and actually attack the Spartan territory. So it was actually illegal to sell them outside of Sparta. They will take their revenge later on, much later on, but oh my, will they take their revenge on the Spartans. Yeah. As these things tend to explode, so will this. But guys, we are about 20 minutes over time, so I'm sorry if this was a little bit convoluted and a little bit unstructured. My vaccine is sort of kind of kicking my butt, so hopefully at least I made some sense. We got through the basic material, and this is such a rich subject that we're probably going to be doing it for at least next 3-4 podcasts, if everyone is all right with that. And after that, I just want to take a jump to Africa, just for fun. Because I think Greeks, everybody thinks they know the Greeks, but I really think that there's so much about them that we don't know. And we have the thing with Greeks, we have so much written material. We almost know too much about them. I mean, there's no such, to where other cultures got wiped out, with Greeks, we just have an abundance of material from all time periods, from every city-state. And Greeks who had, they were not shy to write, they were not limited to formal kind of formats of writing. They didn't have to write just hymns or religious texts. They would write their own personal stories, biographies. They would write love poems. They would personal letters. I mean, whatever. In that sense, the level of education among citizen Greeks was, even slave Greeks, frankly, was pretty high. So we have a lot of information about the ancient Greeks, and thankfully we can kind of go over their history, and it was pretty fine-tooth comb. So.
Well, you're a little bit of a different story than I learned when I was younger, so this is going pretty good for me. But yeah, it'd be fun to touch on Africa, just because we haven't touched on Africa at all either.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, I mean, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of information in it, but it's a region that's omitted in most discussions, and I don't want to omit it because it's a fascinating and a very unique region with its own very distinct and very fascinating history. So.
It's not as popular in Eurocentric history.
All right, guys, thank you. It's really good to see everyone. Appreciate you guys being able to make it. Thanks.
Everybody be well.
Bye.
That exist within every man's soul, and we will live forever, or as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul.